Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Tech.com video, we're going to be discussing the recent comments that John Carmack has been making at QuakeCon. Now, John is pretty much synonymous with gaming at this point, and he is also very well known for his opinions in games development and the game industry as a whole. And he was, of course, speaking about the next generation consoles, the PS4 and Xbox One, the future of gaming, digital distribution, and a lot more besides. One of the first things that John actually said when he came on stage was just how close the two systems are in terms of their capabilities. I'm going to read you guys out a quote. It's almost amazing how close they are in capabilities, how common they are, and how the capabilities they give are essentially the same. We can talk about the differences in memory architectures, but the bottom line is they're both multi-core AMD processors with AMD graphics. So it's weird how close they actually are. However, it's an excellent thing for AMD, he added at the end of that. He did, however, mention that he hasn't done significant benchmarking on both systems. He also mentioned that both systems are still going to have certain things they do better on, but one thing for certain, he seems pretty damn happy with the amount of memory on the systems as well. Now, Carmack has been pretty famous for the fact that he didn't really like the PlayStation 3 as much as the Xbox 360. It wasn't a personal thing. He just felt that the GPU of the Xbox 360 was a lot more accessible, and because of that, he felt that overall, as a gaming system, as a platform to develop on, it was a better system. His opinions aren't particularly unique. Most developers do feel the same way. There are, of course, some who really enjoy working on the PS3 platform because of the cell processor. It lends itself better for their particular engines. However, for the most part, most developers did find the Xbox 360 a bit easier. However, what he has said is that he feels that Sony worked extremely well with the PS3. He said that they came up with much better support, much better kits to work with, much better development support, and a lot more besides. Once again, this isn't particularly new stuff. We've known a lot about this before, but it's just good to hear John's opinions on this. It's good to hear that he does indeed agree with it. Now, he also spoke about next generation of games and what we're actually going to be seeing in his personal opinion. Now, once again, this is not necessarily going to happen, but his certain take on it, has been around in the industry for a while. Now, I'm going to read you guys out a couple of quotes. I think the writing's on the wall, that pushing things to the absolute limit is not really tenable for the most part in development. There's just too much you can do. Nowadays, no one person ever has the entire capabilities of one of the modern platforms in their head. There's just too much to wind up with the crystal jewel of perfection, like you might have had at least deluded yourself into thinking you're approaching in previous years. So development is a lot more about trying to get a good value out of the time that you can put into it. Indeed, he further said that a lot of people have specialists, like for example, you might have a specialist in, say, SIMD, or say GPU code, or memory architectures, or whatever. And because of this, it's really difficult for the whole team to get a creative vision and just be able to drill down and create the perfect, bug-free, perfect product that just performs amazingly. Because, as I've said before, games development is becoming increasingly not only expensive, not only time-consuming, but increasingly complicated as well. And as I said in numerous videos previously, we're going to get to the point where it's going to be a hell of a lot harder for them to start pushing the extra few percent. Now, another point of this, actually, is John himself wasn't really happy with the fact that a lot of developers are pushing for 30 frames per second. He doesn't believe that that frame rate, 30 FPS, is something that you should be striving for in the next generation of systems. Now, we all know that one of the reasons that, well, you're not going with, say, 60 frames per second, which is, generally speaking, what most people consider the target smooth frame rate, is because it takes more processing power, more GPU time. Obviously, if it's only having to put it, say, 30 FPS, it's basically using a hell of a lot less GPU time. It needs a lot less GPU time, a lot less GPU processing power than what it would at 60. And one thing he was talking about was that a lot of the time now, people are doing all these little tiny things with lighting, pushing towards slightly better shadows, slightly better self-lighting, slightly better X or Y, but he believes that a lot of the time it's ego massaging for themselves, the game's developers and so on, but it doesn't actually help to create a smooth experience. And dropped frames, for example, especially in certain games, especially in, say, FPS titles, there's not that much more distracting than when you have a dropped frame of animation. It's pretty bad. Latency, of course, is one thing. Like, if you're playing on a multiplayer game on a server and, you know, your connection stalls for a moment, that's fine, and that's expected. There's not much you can do about it. But when the actual game engine itself is just chugging along, that sucks. Now, it's also worth noting that almost exactly a year ago, the 20th of July 2012, there was another interview, and he was speaking to GameIndustry.biz, and he said, and I quote, that Sony and Microsoft are going to be fighting over gigaflops and teraflops and GPUs and all the like. In the end, it won't make much of a difference. When you get to this, it makes a really big difference in the experience. Nintendo went and bought a motion into the gaming sphere, and while they both have the 10th of the power of the next generation consoles, are able to outsell all of them. He also, more to the point, spoke about a title like, say, Halo. If you take a current game like Halo, which is a 30Hz game at 720p, if you were to run that at 1080p and 60 frames per second with high dynamic frame buffers, all of a sudden you've sucked up all the power you have in the next generation. It will be already what we have, but a lot better. So what exactly is his point in a previous interview? Well, basically what he's saying is that, look, when you start running a game at basically twice the frame rate, you're using, well, a lot higher resolution. It's not really a surprise that you're using a lot of the GPU capability up, and despite obviously the fact that back then he didn't really know how powerful the PS4 GPU was, just as an example, he could kind of ascertain that, look, when you start putting all these things together, you start to really notice that, hey, you're making the gameplay a lot smoother, you're running a lot higher resolution, but those things come at a cost. Now, a lot of us are speaking heavily about lighting, and that's actually one of the analysis that I even did on Killzone. And I have to admit, it does look really pretty. It looks really awesome. However, I'm going to read you guys a quote in regards to the frame rate, because I've spoken about it, and this is, once again, from the QuakeCon just yesterday. It appalls me that we still have people that are targeting 30 Hz for games for the next generation. It was hard to hit 60 on the current generation. There were scars in the code base and on the developers that let us make the quality and performance level that we did. But we've got a lot more power now. And yes, you can throw it away doing some crazy pixel shader, and to get the final little physically correct lighting onto the screen and the pixels, but it's going to be lost to the difference between non-calibrated color in people's TVs. And I think it would be much better for people to concentrate on smoother gameplay experiences. He also went on to say, to reiterate later on into the interview, that obviously everyone and their mother right now wants to know his opinion specifically, but I'm sure other developers as well. But let's face it, id Software are synonymous with, well, FPS engines and engines in general, after all, with the ID Tech or id Tech 4 or 5 or whatever variant of the engine they're using, and so on and so forth. And people, of course, do want to know what his thoughts are. And he said, and I quote, "Everyone would like me to come out and say the A over B comparison about the two platforms. And to be completely honest, I haven't done rigorous benchmarking on them. So even if I didn't have the NDA protection, I wouldn't be able to give you a completely honest answer. But they are very close. They're both very good." That's not to say, however, out of quote, that he was 100% happy with all the stuff of the next generation. He did actually blast Kinect quite heavily. And he's been against Kinect for a while. He doesn't really feel it's that great. Now, obviously, Microsoft have done a number of improvements on Kinect itself for Kinect 2.0, and the purpose behind all of this was to make the experience better. However, he actually likened it to, I don't know if you guys are aware, but the really early Macintoshes, well, up until reasonably recently, but the older Apple Macs, they only had a one-button mouse, and he blasted, well, Apple for that reason alone, because he said it's absolutely pointless having a single button mouse. It meant you basically had to use a modifier key on your keyboard if you want to do that, which for certain creative applications in particular were kind of sucked actually. But what he did say was that when you interact with Kinect, some of the standard interactions there, like position and hold and waiting for different things, it's fundamentally a poor interaction. One way that I look at it is that I used to give Apple a lot of grief about the one button mouse, when anybody working with a mouse really wants more buttons. More buttons are helpful here, and the Kinect is sort of like a zero button mouse with a lot of latency on it. Just so you guys are aware, and this is out of quote, he actually got a lot of sort of polite applause on that and a lot of ooh from the crowd, because I think people, especially at the QuakeCon anyway, the members of the public somewhat agreed with that, which is interesting. He then also spoke about the PS Move, for example, and he said something like the PS Move, where you're maneuvering around and you've actually got buttons on it, or something like the Sixth Sense Razer Hydra, where you've got position tracking, but also buttons to click. I think you have some fundamental advantages. He, of course, wasn't completely burning the Kinect bridge, because one never knows exactly how things are going to go in the future. That's kind of the problem with technology. He did say that, and I quote, "It's a technology that still has a future, and Microsoft are really pushing it hard. They've done a lot of excellent research on it, and I'm still not exactly convinced that it's the cornerstone of the next gaming platform, next generation gaming platform." Basically what he's saying is it's a finer grain control. In other words, that you'll be able to press a pretend button in space and be like, okay, well, this is happening, this is happening. Now, Microsoft have said that they are going to have finger tracking and stuff, but I personally am somewhat in the Carmack camp on this, and I'm not saying I'm a Carmack fanboy. I don't always agree with the stuff that John says, but I've been fairly vocal that I don't like some of the Kinect technology. I don't really like some of the Move technology, actually, even in regards to the PlayStation as well. I've personally never bought the PlayStation I. I've no intention of buying it for my PS4. And this isn't even to do with privacy concerns. John did touch on the privacy stuff, and he actually made a really good point that 10 years ago or whatever, if you guys look, you know, around at some point, you know, in the next few seconds, I can guarantee that what's going to be really close to you is going to be your cell phone. And most people forget that that does actually have a GPS in it. And what my point being that he's actually saying that a lot of people 10 years ago went through exactly the same issues. They were like, well, you know what, this thing has a GPS and people could hack into it and blah de blah de blah. But people got over it. And so he did mention, however, of course, that he wouldn't be surprised if there was a huge hacking scandal and someone did manage to get access to Kinect. But once again, it's another issue of, look, how many people actually have a laptop or a webcam or something attached to their PC? And for all you know, someone's hacked into that. So, of course, very unlikely, but that's my point. Now, another point I'd like to make is that he doesn't believe that games development is suddenly going to go from A to B. In fact, he made it really clear that he thinks a lot of the hops and the skips and the jumps that you saw from previous generations. For example, let's say that you were around in the 16-bit era, which I, of course, myself was. I was fairly young at the time, but still, it was a tangible change from a games development point of view. The POV of someone who was watching the move from, say, the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive, depending on the region of the world you're from, to, say, the Sega Saturn, was tangible. I basically went from a Genesis, or in the UK you'd call it a Mega Drive, along with the CD unit as well, may I add. I went from that, which had some pretty awesome games on it. You know, some of the games did look reasonable for the time, of course. I always hasten to add. Games like Streets of Rage 3 were really pushing the system to its absolute limit, and there were even a couple of games on the Mega Drive that the cartridge actually had FMV. Now, that FMV was very grainy, it had some limits on it, it was very reduced in terms of colour, but it was there. That's the important thing. And the system, of course, was pushing it to the absolute max it could go. There were games like Comic Zone, for example, on the Genesis, and this is the same on the SNES as well. The Super NES had tons of titles that pretty much exactly the same thing. It had, of course, a chip on it. The Genesis also employed that for virtual racing as well. But my point being that they were pushing the games to the absolute limit that the system could go to. However, it was a tangible difference. It was a major disparity between if you went from, say, the Genesis to the Saturn, and you looked at a 2D game on the Saturn, for example, Guardian Heroes, which I've always rated to be one of my favourite games of all time on that system, probably even ever. It's a really cool game. And if you was to look at a title like Guardian Heroes, and you were to see the animation behind it, and then you were to go and play something like Streets of Rage on the Genesis, that's not to say that Streets of Rage on the Genesis sucked, it's just that there was so much of a difference in terms of the crazy stuff that you could do. Now, his point being that, of course, this is just me illustrating a few things, but he doesn't believe that this is going to be the case here. He actually says that games development isn't going to be changing as much, and his exact quote is, games development on there is not changing as much as you might think going from previous generations. You know, we have ways of doing things because it's so conventional approach, we're not tearing up the rule book. Most studios are pretty much evolving the code that they've got. We're not throwing away a couple of million lines of code and doing something completely different. It's still going to be using your cores to run the code, but to generate vertexes and run fragment shaders on it, and that's not changing that much. You've just got lots more of everything. And I think that most of the time will be spent on just making our lives easier so you can do a better job with the games, end quote. And this is another point about creative vision as well. It's really about giving people the tools to actually do their job easier rather than having to go through hoops and struggle. Because he actually made another point of comparison as well, in regards to the memory. He said that, look, one of the issues that studios have now is you do like 90% of the work. You've got the game to a point where it will run, say, on a PC. And, of course, you've got to do some tweaks here and there, maybe a little bit of bug fixing or whatever. So you think to yourself, thank goodness, most of the work's done. Most of the developments are in, most of the assets are in. And then you just need to finish it off, and you've got to get it from running from the dev kits to the final running system and make sure everything runs fine. And that's where you hit problems. That's where you hit issues where games may, say, crash or won't perform very well, or the frame rate will tank or whatever. And as I was going into another interview just a couple of days ago, I was analysing an interview from an Xbox developer. I've forgotten his name, but you guys can check that out if you want. You can just type in Xbox developer on the channel and you'll pop right up. And he was even saying that, look, the problem is one of the reasons that Microsoft and Sony, although he didn't, of course, specifically mention Sony, but he did mention Microsoft, one of the reasons that they've allocated the resources they have to the Xbox One's operating system is so that developers know, okay, this is the playground that we've got. Because one of the issues that developers have is when they don't really know what the goalposts are. Now, it's one thing, say, 2 years down the line for developers to be told, okay, well, you guys actually have another half a gig of RAM, we managed to free that up. But when they're not sure about it initially, just a few bytes of data, we're not talking megabytes, we're not even talking kilobytes, just bytes, quite literally, of data extra. If that memory is trying to be accessed by, say, the game, when in reality it's already been mapped or used up by the operating system, it's going to die, it's going to fall over, simple as that. And that's why John was said, you know what, that's why we want to be told, okay, we have X amount of cores available, X amount of GPU resources available, X amount of memory available, and that's the bottom line. We know we can work within those constraints. And they'd much prefer that. They'd rather not, you know, from developers' point of view, that's why they actually like these memory restrictions, because they know that, you know, Microsoft, Sony can somewhat improve this over time. Another thing as well that I'd like to touch upon, although I don't really want to focus upon it too much because I think it's a good subject for another video, and this video is already becoming fairly lengthy as is. But he actually believes that this console generation could well possibly be the last one. Now, there are really mixed thoughts on that right now because, well, some people believe that Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo, they don't want to give up the control. They believe that, well, and by they, I mean the people who are analysing this stuff, they believe that Microsoft and Sony want to hold as much control over their platforms, their IPs, as much as possible. But John actually said, and I quote, I would bet that there will not be another console generation like this where we think about the Microsoft box, the Sony box after this one. This generation is going to last a long time, and I think likely to come some combination of mobile devices, generic players, cloud streaming, and some other devices will wind up in a sort of fragmentation that around a lot of different front ends and back ends, rather than just having one platform that's going to be developed on. But you'll have to come back in probably 8 years to know whether this prediction comes true, because this console generation is going to have a lot of legs on it. End quote. This is actually very contrary to what a lot of developers want in terms of, say, Ubisoft and EA. I've mentioned heavily that they've said that, look, the previous console generation, the Xbox 360, the PlayStation 3, they lasted quite simply too long. The problem is, I don't care how powerful a system is on launch, there is a finite amount of power that you can put in. You know what, you can go out right now, you can splunk down £3,000 on a, just pounds, doesn't matter if it's pounds or dollars, but pounds on a PC, and okay, you're going to have a PC that's going to last a lot longer. It's going to definitely be able to play games in, say, 2-3 years' time at reasonable high settings, compared to, say, someone else who spends, say, £600 on a system. Definitely it's going to last a hell of a lot longer, but in reality there's going to be a lot better, more powerful systems out there. And the problem is, of course, that, well, consoles aren't like that. You can't put, you know, 3,000 or 2,000 or whatever worth of equipment into a console because it's just not feasible. So in which case, both in terms of costs to you, costs to the consumer, and various other bits and pieces as well. And therefore, that's one of the issues that developers are going to have to be dealing with. They're going to have to say, look, you know what, we realise that these platforms are fixed, and that's one of the things he's saying about cloud gaming as well. I'm not 100% convinced that personally, I don't think cloud gaming is going to be here for a long time. Well, for a long while anyway. I don't really know exactly. I can't really give you guys a time frame. I would hope personally that it sits alongside regular gaming. That's just my personal take on it, but it's really difficult to know what the future is going to predict. And one of the benefits, of course, of the cloud is it doesn't really matter what the resources are from the point of view of the customer of what your game takes up. It doesn't matter if it requires 8 megabytes of memory, 8 gigabytes of memory, or 80 gigabytes of memory to run. It's not your issue. It would simply be part of the cloud, but obviously then there would be intrinsic costs associated with that, because it would obviously need those resources to run. So a lot of the stuff is still really early in terms of how this is going to be running, how a lot of this stuff is going to function. But anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. I would encourage you to check out his interview, well, I say interview, but his spotlight yourselves if you've got about an hour and 10 minutes, whatever it was. Can't remember exact running time, but it's a 2-part thing. But anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.